Welcome back to Acts chapter 27. We continue our conversation about daybreak. Dawn is about to hit and it finally arrives. It draws near. This is where we left off. It meant that everybody had to swim to shore. Look at it. Acts chapter 27. Now let's pick it up on verse 33, 34, and 35. Until the day was about to dawn. You see that? Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, and now he says this: today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating and having taken nothing. Paul, can you imagine that? Kept track when everybody lost track of how long they've been out there. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair from your head of any of you will perish. Wow, I should have been on that ship, right? Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and he began to eat. These words identify an eighth principle of leadership. A leader focuses on the objectives, not the obstacles. A leader focuses on the objectives and not the obstacles. Now, let's see if we can kind of put this into perspective. Okay? You go, well, how did you get that from reading where they sat down to eat? Well, just be patient. Be patient. Go back to verse 21. Acts 27:21. Because Luke had already mentioned this, okay? And the passengers and the crew, okay, they had not eaten for a long time. There was this abstinence of food. Okay? Go back to verse 21. And when they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. You remember the great I told you so? Remember that great I told you so speech? Right here, he's recognizing they had not eaten. Here we learn that for the entire 2 weeks of the storm, they continued battling the elements without eating any food. But now they had some hard work ahead of them, and they were going to need some strength. Can you imagine? It's not going to get any better. Now they're going to have to work even harder. They got no clue they're going to have to swim to shore. Now remember, they're about 3 miles off the shoreline of Malta. Paul, he's the ever-clear thinking leader, urged them to take some nourishment. He looked right past the storm. It wasn't even on his mind anymore. Beyond the urgency of the moment, that's no longer on his mind anymore. And he saw that they needed to prepare for the ordeal that lay ahead. He could see the bigger picture. Remember the 38,000 foot level? You got to see the bigger picture. Pastor, leader, you always have to be seeing the bigger picture. You got to see ahead what's coming. While everyone else was still seeing the obstacles, Paul had his eyes fixed on the objective. No dinghy, no skiff, no boat. How do we get to shore? And Paul sees the objective. We got to get to shore. They don't know it yet. They're going to have to swim. They're going to need all the food and nourishment in their body because they're going to need all the strength in order to make it. Now, he hasn't told them that yet, but he knows that. And now he says, this is for your survival. Paul told them this. Jump back down to verse 34. Acts chapter 27, verse 34. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. This is for your survival, for not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. They say, what? There is no boat. You're going to have to swim to shore. You're going to be saved. You won't even be injured. But you need a good breakfast right now. Again, we see the perfect balance between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Do you see that? Paul was getting them to forget their fears, the threat of death in the storm, the challenge of a nearly impossible swim to shore, and rather partake of the necessary nourishment they would need to make it. You know, Paul's taking it one step at a time. He can see down the road, but he's taking one step at a time. See, I remember as a football player how I can come into the huddle in a critical moment in the game. Facing a last down effort to score, and after we score, we're going for two. I can remember that. So line up quickly after the touchdown to catch him in the defensive switch. The strategy was to get people past the fear of the moment. Never mind everybody else fear, I was afraid. These guys were big. I was a teeny little thing. Paul did that, giving words of encouragement that ignored the very formidable obstacles. He no longer had them looking at the obstacle. Eat. You're going to need your strength. Then Luke said, Paul took bread and gave thanks to God in everyone's presence, thus reinforcing once again the source of his authority and the source of his hope. He himself began to eat. Here's a truth that any godly mother knows. Two keys to serving the Lord are prayer and a good breakfast, brother. Paul did not neglect the crew's physical needs and lecture them about the spiritual needs of their souls. He didn't do that. He balanced the spiritual and the physical. Do you understand what I'm saying? Then he himself began to eat, becoming an example for all to follow. Now we come to another key leadership point, another key characteristic. The ninth one is the principle is leadership empowers by example. Leadership empowers. It empowers by example. I want you to notice the effect of this. Now look down at verse 36. Acts chapter 27, verse 36. It says this. And all of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. For the one moment in 2 weeks of a hellish storm, they now are encouraged for the first time. And who was the cheerleader? Paul. Paul's courage became infectious. Everyone partook of the overdue and refreshment, and it had the desired effect. It had what Paul wanted. They all began to feel better. They began to feel stronger and more hopeful. And then all hands set to work. Here's what Luke records at the crucial detail he had not yet given. Look at verse 37. You see how we're working our way down through the text. Because you have to read all of the text with its context to understand exactly what's being laid out here for us. And now, I keep saying there's 276 people. You go, well, where do you get that idea from? Well, verse 37. All of us in the ship were 276 persons. You got that? So you had all of these passengers, all of the crew, and the prisoners. There's 276 people, because that's what a typical cargo ship would carry, is 276 people. And the ship's owner did not put their boats out to sea without it having completely loaded, because they want to make sure that everybody paid their fare. Perhaps they did a head count during breakfast to verify the exact number of people on board. I have no idea. I got no clue. This would be essential later when they regrouped on shore to be sure that everyone had survived. Maybe that's what they did. The scripture doesn't tell us. It just tells us the facts. Then they set to work on the final task. The ship needed to be as light as possible when they ran it aground. Look what it says in verse 38. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. Excuse me. So now everybody eats. Now you got all 276 people up on top of this boat. And they're dumping all the remaining food, everything out, because now they're going to make sure this boat can get closer and closer and closer, and it's going to hit something, it's going to run aground. The remainder of the cargo, which had served as a ballast until now, was dumped. Thus, for the owner and the crew of the ship, All hopes of salvaging anything but their lives was gone. And here it is. The prophecy was being fulfilled to the letter. There will be no lost life, but everything else will be lost. Daylight finally breaks through. Go with me, verse 39 and 40. Acts chapter 27, verse 39 and 40. And when the day came, they could not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach. And they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. Now they can see. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind. They were heading for the beach. So now they cut the anchors off. They hoisted the foresail. That's the one that's in front. Okay, the wind is blowing, and they're hoping that this is going to carry them close enough before they run aground. They're going to hit some rocks, some jagged rocks. They're going to hit something, and they finally can go no further. But it's going to get them a lot closer, and then they have to swim for their lives. That's the plan. Here we see why it was so essential for the crew to remain on board. Only experienced sailors would know how to do these things. The rudder had to be tied down because of the storm. In heavy winds like that, the rudder would be impossible to hold for long, and the ship would have steered itself in circles. It would have just been going in circles. That's all they would have been doing. So it had been fastened with taut, heavy ropes to set as straight on course as possible in the storm. Now it needed to be free so that the pilot could maneuver the ship right to the beach. Only experienced people can do that without ripping their arms off. By the hand of God's sovereign providence, their course had brought them to the propitious spot, perfect place. One of the few places in that vast expanse of the Mediterranean Sea where they could try to beach such a massive grain ship. It wasn't a rocky cliff or a craggy shoreline, but a bay with a beach. Isn't that great? They're casting off the anchors, meaning most likely that they simply cut the ropes off. There was no point in wrestling 4 heavy anchors aboard. There's no point in that. It was clear to all by now that the ship would be a total loss, as Paul had predicted. They raised a sail. The actual Greek word would suggest that it may have been a foresail rather than a mainsail, and they steered it to the beach. So typically it would be a foresail, okay? They had no idea what was to come. They were headed for a virtual wall. They understood that. Look at verse 41. You see how we're working our way through this? So in verse 41 it says, but striking a reef where 2 seas met. They hit a reef. They ran the vessel aground, and now the prow stuck fast and remained unmovable. But the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. So what happens is, this is reef. Okay? And the front of the ship hits this thing, and it gets stuck. Okay? With the impact, now the waves that are coming behind it is battering the rear end of the ship. Now, waves are designed to propel a ship. You understand that, of course, right? That's how it's designed, to propel it, move it along. But when the ship is standing there and the waves are pounding on it, okay, and now it's already been 2 weeks of hurricane force gale winds, okay, pounding on this thing, now it's hitting the ship so hard, now it's beginning, okay, it's beginning to fall apart, break apart, because it has no give, okay, it's not moving. They had no idea it was about to come, okay? St. Thomas on the east side of Malta perfectly fits the description of a place where the 2 seas met, because that's kind of the description that we're given here. Ocean currents converge there at what's called the Mongsar Reef. Okay, it's a submerged peninsula protruding 1.5 miles into the sea. So you understand that you can see this reef. Okay, it comes up and down depending on the water level, and it's all rocks, and it's coming all the way up for 1.5 miles. We know that. Okay? Breakers from the two currents come together right over the reef, causing waves to form in a unique crisscross fashion. Okay? So this boat is not going to last long now. It's being pounded on both sides. Especially in a storm, the waves crashing together give the distinct impression of two seas colliding. Immediately under that place, the hidden reef is shallow enough to ground a ship. So now it's just this is the perfect storm of all things that can go wrong, went wrong, had gone wrong, is wrong. From the ship's position coming into the bay, it would have appeared that they had a clear path to shore, so they steered for it. That's what it appeared to them. But the ship ran aground on the shallow reef because they couldn't see that. The prow stuck fast. That's what it means, that the front end hit this thing right away. And the violent breakers continued battering the back of the ship until it finally could tolerate no more stress, and it began to break up. That's literally what happens. Okay? You got no choice. You got to jump into the water and head for shore. Now this is what's happening. All hands are safe at last. Finally, the ship was thus stranded some distance from the shore. We're not told how far. We know that the reef is at least 1.5 miles out. So if you want to take that as your point of reference, they were 3 miles out. Now about 1.5 miles in, they hit this reef, more or less. The raging winds and the waves continued battering until the pieces of the disintegrating ship were floating everywhere. Now this thing is floating everywhere, and it was clear all on board that no option but to swim safely. I mean, they're still now the crew is moving toward the front, the passengers, everybody moving toward the front, and this thing in the back is falling apart. Now you can see all the debris, all the wooden planks, everything that's out there. At that point, the soldiers realized it was going to be every man for himself. And they weren't about to go into those raging waters with chained to prisoners. They go, we're not doing that. Because every soldier had to have a chained prisoner with him. And in such a chaotic life or death situation, it would be virtually impossible to keep track of prisoners swimming free. You're not going to keep track of that. But as we noted in the very beginning of this study in chapter 1, if a Roman soldier lost a prisoner, he paid with his life. Remember that? So they devised a plan to slaughter Paul and the rest of the prisoners to guarantee that they wouldn't get away. This is a discussion among the soldiers. Look at this. Look at verse 42 and 44. 42, 43, and 44. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. That was the plan. But the centurion wanted to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. So what did the soldiers do? They unchained themselves from all the prisoners, and they followed orders. Let everybody try to make it to shore. And then it says in verse 44, and the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship that were floating in the water. And so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. Now look at this. They were all brought, look at the end of verse 44. And so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. Isn't that incredible? Since Paul's wise leadership had not only endeared him to Julius, but also made him indispensable, the centurion halted his soldiers' plan to kill the prisoners. In different circumstances, he might well have authorized the slaughter. It was, after all, from the perspective of worldly wisdom, from the world's position, okay, from the world's wisdom, the prudent thing to do, kill the prisoners. But the centurion, it says here in verse 43, wanting to save Paul. Is it any wonder why? If there was one guy Julius did not want to lose, it was the man who had performed so admirably as a leader, and that was Paul. So he ordered those who could swim to head for shore, and the rest grabbed boards, pieces of the disintegrating ship, floating debris, whatever they could find to keep them afloat, and they paddled for shore. Imagine 276 people diving into the waves powerful enough to destroy a huge cargo ship, and every one of them making it safely to shore. That's leadership. The odds against it are astronomical. But that is exactly what happened. 276 people jumped into the water, and 276 people met on the shore in the middle of a major storm, in a maelstrom. That was the result of leadership, the grace and the mercy of God. The first thought that every one of them must have had was thankfulness to God. Paul worshiped, because Paul kept mentioning God, kept pointing them to God, the God of their salvation. It was going to be God that was going to lead them out of this situation. His promises are sure. His word is true. God's angel had told Paul that this would happen, and it came to pass exactly as he said. See, Paul's triumph was the triumph of great leadership. We so underestimate that. Tested in the crucible of crisis, he stepped up and showed how a true leader acts. He was decisive. He wasn't wishy-washy. He didn't put his finger up in the wind to find out which way people wanted to go, what they thought about it. He was determined. He was clear-thinking and level-headed. He took control when things were otherwise out of control. And God honored his efforts with amazing success. He didn't compromise the absolutes, nor was he distracted from his objective by the obstacles, and as he led by example. See, you're beginning to get the picture here of what true leadership involves. In circumstances when lesser men would have been passive or just simply given up, Paul took charge and became an example to all who are called to be leaders. You need to understand Acts chapter 27 and 28 if you're going to become a leader. You're just stuck on Acts chapter 2 on the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and you can't get past that. You're playing with a toy. Leadership is what God has called you to do. It was one of the outstanding episodes in the life of this noble Christian to obey, who by God's design has much to teach us all about the rigors and the rewards of true leadership. Are you a leader? You see, people's lives are at stake. And the lives of your people is at stake. A doctor can make a wrong call and you die. A lawyer can make the wrong call and you go to jail. But a preacher makes the wrong call and you may wind up going to hell.